Good morning. Welcome. My name's Greg Bamber, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the International Consortium for Research in Employment and Work, which is part of the Centre for Global Business at Monash Business School. And we have two partners who are co-hosting this webinar, the Australian Labour and Employment Relations Association and the Industrial Relations Society of Victoria, and you're all very welcome. Let me start by, as usual, by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which our Monash University Australian campuses stand, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. There are more than 200 people registered for this webinar, so forgive me not acknowledging everyone, but I would like to particularly acknowledge the Dean of our faculty, Professor Simon Wilkie, and I can see colleagues are with us from around the world, which is the silver lining. If there is a silver lining to the pandemic, it's that we're able to have Zoominars like this with people around the world. I can see good colleagues, Paul Clark from Penn State and other colleagues from the UK, and the President of the Fair Work Commission here in Australia, Ian Ross. But my role is to introduce our moderator, my boss and friend, Margaret Gardner, who's the president of Monash University. And many people know her as a professor and a vice chancellor and chair of the Group of 8 research intensive Australian universities. But some of us who are present today are lucky enough to have known Margaret in her earlier academic life too, which adds to her suitability to moderate this international webinar. And briefly, she has a doctorate in industrial relations from Sydney University, and she has a doctorate from Sydney University in common with our keynote speaker. However, Tom's is an honorary doctorate from Sydney. And Margaret, also in the industrial relations field, was a professor at Griffith University and is a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and has served as president of our Industrial Relations Academics Association in Australia and New Zealand. Margaret serves and has served on many other boards and committees, and was a Fulbright Fellow in the US, including at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. So I'll hand over to you, Margaret, to introduce our guest speaker and to moderate the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bamber. Greg, it's really a great pleasure to be here, and we are extremely fortunate to have Professor Tom Cockin with us for this special webinar event. And I'm personally very delighted to see him again and to be able to introduce him to you today. I was struck by a recent New York Books reflection by Michael Powell on How the Awful Stuff Won, in which he says, "Something has been damaged about the world in which people live. The social, political and physical spheres have all entered a figuratively or literally hotter and more unstable state." And you can probably see why that might have resonated. We seem to me sometimes more like swarms when you're looking at our activities in the world, more like swarms than groups organised for collective public good. And it is that organisation for collective public good and the way it facilitates and is facilitated by a new social contract that I think is necessary to rebuild and stop the awful stuff winning. So I'm really looking forward to what I hope is an important debate after what I'm sure will be an illuminating address by Tom. Professor Cockin has had a long-standing connection to Monash, visited the university several times. Some of you may recall his visit in 2014 to speak at the symposium, an event that's held jointly with the University of Melbourne in honour of the late great Joe Isaac, Emeritus Professor Joe Isaac. Professor Cockin himself has had, as you all know, a long and distinguished career and has been really a remarkable mentor to many, and is therefore, for all his contributions, much respected by his colleagues and former students, and some of them have also spoken at our symposiums. He's a global affiliate of the International Consortium for Research in Employment and Work, the Centre for Global Business, and the Monash Business School. He's also the George Maverick Bunker Professor and co-director of the MIT Sloan Institute for Work and Employment Research at the MIT Sloan School of Management. His work over many decades focusing on employment policies, institutions and practices has always worked at how they remain current and relevant within a changing workforce and economy. And his recent work has been highlighting the challenges that working families face in meeting their responsibilities at work, at home, and within their communities. And I want to say it's that sort of work and research and the way it is then communicated into the world, and hopefully finding the opportunity for people to act on those research findings. That sort of work is vital to finding new connections and forging a new social contract. Through his pathfinding research, Tom demonstrates that fundamental changes in the quality of employee and labour management relations are needed to address critical problems in a range of industries. And I think that understanding it in industrial context is important for how people work through what is now a quite different landscape for labour management relations than it was even 30 years ago. And so I think the topic he raises today, which spans the whole area of how we as people gain our meaning through work, and how through work we find new connections, and that through that you would hope we have some of the great ability to forge a new social contract. Please join me in welcoming Professor Cockin. I'm really looking forward to hearing him speak. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. What a wonderful introduction, and welcome to where I feel sort of back home again at Monash, and with all our good Australian friends and colleagues. I've spent a great deal of time in Australia. I've been privileged to be at Monash. I've been privileged to benefit from the rich history of research in industrial relations and employment relations that has continued to come out of your university, and I hope will continue to flourish in the years ahead. It's so important right now that we have the kinds of conversations that we're going to have here today to see if we can't find common cause in building a new social contract. As Margaret said, in dealing with all of the dysfunctional and disruptive actions that we've been through and continue to be through, some of human making and some of maybe more natural events or unpredictable events like the pandemic. And so what I'd like to do today is to talk about how can we learn from these experiences? How can we learn from a longer history of the need for a new social contract? And then how can we move forward in making it happen? And I also want to make sure that I thank my good friend and colleague, Greg Bamber, for helping to organize this and to initiate it, and to the Monash Business School and all of the co-sponsors in this discussion. So I'm going to start with a few comments, but then I would really like to make sure that we have a dialogue as we move forward. So let's see if we can move to the next slide. I'm going to emphasize three challenges that we're taking away from the current crisis in the United States, but I think around the world. I'll obviously focus on what we're experiencing here. But first, I think we need to really learn about how we can make our economy not only more productive, but more resilient and more inclusive moving forward. And then under what conditions, how do we reopen? I understand that in Victoria, just today, you may be lifting a little bit of the lockdown restrictions. Well, we have to do this in acceptable ways and very sensitive ways. And then hopefully the longer run, we can think about how we can build a new contract based on this. But before we do it, before we get into the current situation, I want to put this in the context of where we have come from over the last several decades. And this is a chart that I use all the time when I give talks about the situation. It shows that why we need a social contract, and particularly in the United States, but these same trends are visible in Australia, in other countries around the world, maybe not as starkly shown as this particular chart. But this is a chart that shows, if we start way back here in the end of World War II in the 1940s, up through the 70s and into around 1980, the two lines, the productivity of the country and the hourly compensation of average workers, moved together so that as the economy grew, so too did average family incomes. Now, some people were left out of that. Women did not fare as well as men. Minorities did not fare as well as whites, and people in the what we now call fissurized or gig economy, those who were in that status already also didn't fare as well. And so still we had this growth in tandem, which really kept building our middle class. And then around 1980, productivity continues to grow, but compensation flatlines. And if there's one picture that shows and illustrates why there's so much anger and frustration that has built up in our society and exploded then in 2016 with our election, it's this one. Because if we see the economy growing, but we don't see our own family situation sharing in that growth, the frustrations build up, and people are looking for a way to address that problem. So we have seen that moving into this pandemic, we were beginning to come out of some of the problems. We had 5 years of solid job growth. Employers were complaining about a talent shortage and that they couldn't find enough workers. We still had slow wage growth, but because we had pressure for increases in the minimum wage in states, the so-called Fight for 15 in the United States, it was forcing some of the larger employers in the retail industry and other low-wage firms to finally begin to raise wages. So we even at the bottom began to see some wage growth. But at the same time, as we all know, people were getting more and more worried about how automation may take away jobs and what's the future of work and will robots eat all of our jobs. And so there was some anxiety about that, and many of us were focused on that and continue to be focused on it. We have a task force here at MIT focused on work of the future that I'm part of, and we are addressing those kinds of issues. In the United States, we then had this big tax cut for business that further increased inequality, and we have seen more and more rise of worker protests, not only here, but as we'll talk about around the world, with workers expressing a stronger interest in joining unions and finding other ways to get a voice at work through mechanisms that maybe go outside of our traditional labor law. Even the Business Roundtable, the largest group of employers in the United States, the big businesses, finally in 2019 made a statement saying, well, maybe we have to address these issues, and maybe all this unrest is getting us worried that our businesses will and our free market economy might be threatened. So perhaps we have to start to respond more to these multiple stakeholders at work and not just focus on maximizing shareholder value. So this was the context that we experienced before the pandemic. Some hope, some growth, but then some setbacks with the way in which we were beginning to manage these things. But then here comes the crisis. And I'm going to focus on what we've learned here in the United States, or what I hope we are learning about our safety net, about the need to rebuild worker trust, the need to navigate our return to work carefully, what the Black Lives Matter and the quest for social and racial justice has done, and perhaps maybe laying a foundation for how we move forward. So let me start with what we have been learning here in the United States. More so perhaps than other countries which have had a stronger set of employment standards for a longer period of time than we have had here. But the stark effects of all of a sudden 22 million people being thrown out of work in the United States in April and May and June really showed us the weaknesses in our safety net. And it starts with the fact that when you lose your job in the United States, you're likely to lose your health care. That's something we've inherited and carried forward from the early years after World War II to today. And it may have worked well in the past, but it certainly is no longer acceptable in the United States. So that we have to find a way now to learn from this experience to provide some form of supplemental or guaranteed healthcare. And that's not a political statement about what form that strategy should take, but it's very clear that on the national agenda, we need to provide guaranteed healthcare for people, especially the most vulnerable people who tend to be most affected by job loss. We also have this problem in the United States of being the last industrialized country in the world not to provide paid family or paternal leave or sick leave. And so we had to enact some emergency legislation on those issues just to make sure that we could help those people, particularly in smaller businesses and low-wage workers, get the coverage that they were needing in order to take care of their family and in this very difficult time. Our unemployment insurance system showed up again as covering about 25 to 28% of those unemployed. So what did we have to do? We had to expand it. And we should learn from that we can't leave so many people, whether they're in the gig economy or young workers without enough work history, or low-wage workers who don't qualify because they don't earn the income that's needed, or people who are moving across jobs. All of those people who are so common in our workforce today have been left out of our system. So we had to pass emergency pandemic unemployment insurance to cover people who have been left out. All of our countries, and I'm part of a group with the World Economic Forum that is very much focused on the need to retrain workers today, because many of those jobs that were lost are not coming back. Jobs in restaurants, in hotels that have been devastated, in hospitality and services, but also many jobs in manufacturing, because we're going to reconfigure our supply chains to become more resilient. There's much more investment in technology going on in organizations today, in manufacturing and in other organizations, so that they can be more resilient and buffered from future disruptions. And so the nature of jobs that are going to come back are going to be different. And if we don't recognize that we are probably in the environment of the biggest redeployment of the labor force of our experience since World War II, then we are going to have another long-term permanent unemployment problem in the United States. And we're already beginning to see the signs of that happening, because the temporary jobs have come back. The people who have lost their jobs on a very temporary basis are starting to come back more quickly, but the longer term unemployed is growing. And that is a big problem. And I believe we're seeing that around the world as well. My colleagues in Europe are very concerned about this, and we're seeing a resurgence in training in the best companies and in some industries, but it's going to have to be even bigger. And then finally, we have so much concern here in the United States about retaliation against immigrants. That's our particular unfortunate development and problem and an embarrassing situation where immigrants are often afraid to come out to even apply for benefits for fear of getting identified as undocumented and at risk of deportation. But we're seeing the immigrant issue emerge around the world as well. And so we've got all of these issues which have just been accelerated and made even more apparent by this crisis. And my hope is that it will be a learning exercise. I believe we are not going to go back to a world where some of these big gaps in coverage of these people that we call essential workers are left out of our safety net. But it's going to take some political courage to move forward aggressively in that direction. I'm hoping that we will do so. But let me stay on this issue of care for emergency workers, because all of a sudden we've discovered the people who deliver our food, the people who are in our transportation systems, the people who are in our manufacturing and food production systems, the people who are in critical supply chain jobs, all others, including and especially those in education and healthcare today. These are now what we are beginning to see as essential workers. Maybe we were blind to their importance in the past, or we didn't appreciate them. And we have so many in these, particularly human services, that are poorly paid. But we've got to recognize that they are calling for a new voice at work. They're particularly calling for a new voice to deal with the safety issues. I'm going to stress that even more in a few moments. But they're calling for a recognition that they are providing needed services for us, while many of us are doing what we are doing right here, able to do the work we do from a remote site, maybe disadvantaged, and maybe we complain about it, but roughly, really, we don't have much to complain about. Our jobs are not at risk. Our healthcare is being protected. Our family situations are perhaps a bit more stable and not as vulnerable as people who are coming back and forth from their work sites. Well, if we don't start to deal with their needs and provide them a voice, we have big companies, whether they are Amazon or Walmart or McDonald's or Google or other very progressive employers, that are putting in place practices they believe are responsive to the workforce. But if we don't listen to the workforce and their particular needs and their healthcare needs and their family situations and allow them to have a voice in shaping the conditions under which they come to work, we're going to have a very angry workforce. We have had in the United States, for example, 40,000 new petitions to our Occupational Safety and Health Administration about these issues. Unfortunately, that agency is dormant and is not doing anything about them. But here we have people who don't have a voice at work to address their basic kinds of conditions. We have to fix that as part of a new labor policy when we get an opportunity to do so. And we have to open up our labor policy to new forms of employee voice, new forms of participation, so that every worker can protect herself and himself and their peers in these kinds of situations. So that's an issue that I think is particularly important. It was important before, but it's even more important now. Well, what do we do when we start to come back to work? I think we are all going to be tested around the world in the ability to understand the conditions under which we can make work more inclusive, more productive, and more effective for all concerned. I mentioned safety, but it's really at the top of everyone's list of concerns today. They clearly are asking for more evidence that there's both top-down leadership, the kind of policies that our organizations are putting in place, and that there's no substitute for strong leadership at the top, demonstrating a commitment to safety and demonstrating a commitment to the agile and the flexible ways in which people have to work today. But that has to be buttressed and complemented by bottom-up organizing and bottom-up leadership. We teach about distributed leadership at MIT, and I'm sure at Monash and at all of our universities, that everyone can be a leader if given the opportunity. If there ever was a time to listen to the workforce and allow groups to come together to express their needs and to work out their solutions. Just as, give you an example, just as the pandemic was beginning to emerge in the United States, I got assigned to mediate a very difficult labor management dispute in Seattle with their major nonprofit health hospital system and their nurses and their environmental service workers, that is the people who provide the food and clean the rooms and do all of the delivery and the services to support the healthcare process. It was a very nasty dispute, but we worked out a solution, and we worked out an agreement to the basic labor conditions as the pandemic was beginning to rage in Seattle, Washington. But at the same time, they said, look, we've got to have a new approach to bringing people back to work when they come back, because they were already sending people home. And they worked out a supplemental family support system. They worked out a process by which the labor organizations would work across hospitals to provide support as needed to deal with the pandemic, and all kinds of bottom-up leadership developed with the support of the governor and with the support of hospital management and leadership in the industry. And they set a good role model and set of examples for how one does this. We can do more of that because we need leadership from all parties. But we also have to recognize that when we come back, everybody's family situation is a little bit different, and this is very difficult to manage. We in our field have always felt that we should have equivalent or equal or equitable treatment of people who work together, who do the same job, basically under the same conditions. That's a strong principle of our field. But now we have even more challenges, because I might have a very different family situation, a very different health situation than someone else. And coming back to work to do the same job, the same work in the same way may not be possible. And that's going to create some tensions. It already is creating some disparities. And we have to make sure that people talk to each other, work out at the work group level. And again, as part of that agreement in Seattle, the parties recognize this. And one of the things we did was to have a new agreement that we are going to have a staffing strategy from the bottom up, supported by leadership, approved in the end by leadership, but let the teams decide how they were going to work out these different patterns of different needs of people with different family or health conditions or needs for variation. That way we can manage these differences if we recognize them and build scheduling consensus, team by team, and so on. Then we have this big challenge. At MIT, we now have a whole group that is looking at how are we going to work in more remote ways, and how are we going to balance that with working in the offices and on campus, not only as we come back to teach, but to do the whole range of activities. And I think every organization is involved in this meeting, this challenge today. But unfortunately, we have some vendors out there who are selling software to monitor people and monitoring screen time and monitoring what we are doing with our screen time. And if we want to frustrate people and lose the trust and support, then we can listen to these vendors and buy their tools and use that as a way of monitoring and managing the workforce. Instead, I think we have to start to become even more proficient at managing by project results. Manage what we do and what we achieve, and let's make sure that we have clear expectations for what the needs are for project goals and project milestones and project achievements, or course goals or research objectives and so on. But we've got to recognize that people have varying different schedules and varying working habits, and we can't monitor them the way in which some of the technologists are offering to do so. I'm particularly concerned that that is spreading way too fast across industry at the moment. And then finally, we have challenges of how do we maintain our creativity at work. We have to find ways to use the technology that we are experiencing here today more creatively so that we can manage to substitute for the personal interaction that we all have when we see someone at work and we see that they've got a great idea and they're all excited and they come down the hall or to another desk or another office and start to talk about it. And we debate it a little bit and it gets stronger or it gets modified or it gets reinforced. That kind of creative, informal interaction is harder to do. But I think we're learning from remote processes. And our colleagues, I hear that Paul Clark, our future leader of LIRA, is and longstanding LIRA leader, helped us all as we developed the virtual side of our professional association and held our last conference effectively by bringing people together, and now have continued that with a virtual set of webinars and so on. I think we can find ways to do this creatively and make the most of this technology, but we have to do it carefully. And then ultimately, all of us are suffering a bit from the mental health and the stresses that this raises. And my friends who are in the ombuds profession report that there's an epidemic of concern around mental and emotional health care at work today that they are seeing. So we have to double down on managing those issues as well. Well, where does this take us? I believe it takes us right up to the next crisis that emerged, and that was from the renewed protests around racial justice that started here in the United States from tragic deaths of Black men and women from police violence. But it's spread across the world. And we have to learn from that experience too, that too much of our racism and institutional racism and even the microaggressions or offenses that we sometimes do unconsciously in our organizations need to be addressed more effectively. And we're seeing this happen all around the world, not just as a Black Lives Matter movement, which has spread to Australia and spread to other countries, but also the rise, even before that, of extremist groups, extremist political movements that are threatening our democracies and threatening the future of our world, and all of the principles of good employment relations that we have been emphasizing and working toward over the years. This is a threat to our democratic values and our principles, and we have to stand strong for equity, for dispute resolution, for recognizing the legitimacy of protests, but doing it then in ways that allow us to address these issues, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the extremist movements that need to be addressed, the backlash against immigrants that we've seen in Europe and certainly in North America and the United States in particular, the protests in support of your ancestors, the indigenous people of Australia and all of our countries. In the United States, we've seen a rise of COVID cases, particularly in our Indian, Native American communities. And we have to be sensitive to the fact that, again, they have been left out of this process. And as you do loosen up from your pandemic lockdowns, the protests and the issues that are arising there need to be addressed. So we have seen growing protests. I'm encouraged by them because I think we're seeing young people use creative mechanisms to organize and to mobilize. We've seen it at the workplace, at Google with use of social media, at Walmart with the use of artificial intelligence tools and machine learning to educate workers about their rights at work, and in organizations where there have been bankruptcies, like one of our largest retailers, Toys R Us, where organizations called United for Respect have mobilized workers and demanded severance pay and gotten severance payments for those people who lost their jobs, and then achieved a landmark agreement to get a voice at the corporate level with what they call a mirror board. That is, the employees able to meet with the CEO and top level board members on a periodic basis to express their ideas for how to rebuild the organization and how to come out of bankruptcy and how to rebuild jobs as we move forward. We're seeing creative use of these kinds of mechanisms for mobilizing and raising our voices all around the world. We have to figure out how we can incorporate them into our industrial relations and employment relations system and welcome them in parallel with existing organizations, labor unions, collective bargaining, works councils, representation on corporate boards, and the other kind of mechanisms that in Australia, as we have the leaders of the Fair Work Commission, that you are responsible for regulating and helping to nurture viable forms of worker voice, the forms that people are talking about today and are most interested in seeing develop. So I think it's an exciting time. And it's an exciting time to take advantage of the innovations that are coming out of our crisis situations, and then see if we can't put them to work to build a new social contract that brings the various groups together in our society and new voices. So by all means, we need to engage employers, large employers, small, medium-sized employers, but we have to get to the entrepreneurial community. I'm encouraged by the range of entrepreneurs who are social entrepreneurs now, developing these new mechanisms for worker voice, trying to find new ways to deliver healthcare, coming out to help people now in the education communities to meet the needs of kids who are working at home and to find ways to extend the internet more effectively and to find cures for the COVID pandemic and develop new ways to deliver personal protective equipment and to find new vaccines that will help us treat this illness. Well, these are the best of entrepreneurs and they need to be part of a new social contract, and we need to get them to use their talents to address these big problems that we have in our societies. And alongside that, the technology vendors who are so focused on artificial intelligence and robotics, let's put those tools to work on the big problems that we have and hold them accountable for being constructive citizens in our communities, and work then with those of us in education and labor and in government who need to come together. So if there's one thing that I think is absolutely critical for all of us as academics today in our field and in allied fields around us, whether they are technical, engineering, or social science or humanities, we've got to move from just our narrow professional pursuits to addressing these big social, economic, and political problems. And indeed, we're trying to do that through our task force on work of the future. We're about to issue another report of our group. And this is a group of engineers, the best robotics experts, the best AI experts in our School of Science, and our best economists and political scientists, all of us working together to try to find a way to deal with the inequality issues, to make sure that we use technologies to advance the world of work, to create higher quality jobs, and to create a more equitable distribution of the welfare or of the benefits that we achieve through these processes. So that's where I think our profession is. It's a very exciting time. It's a very worrisome time, but out of crisis in the past has come new ways to work together, new institutional developments, and the invention of the next social contract. So that's our task, and I hope we can get on with it. So let me stop there, Margaret, and see if I've provoked some ideas, or I would certainly welcome your thoughts We had great conversations about these issues many years ago when you were with us at MIT and periodically through visits. And so I know it's front and center on your mind as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tom. That was really challenging, and I know there are some questions that will come to be answered. And I just wanted to take you back to where you've gone to the point of the myriad forms of unrest, and we see periods of that, and we actually know that you get periods of social unrest, and then the question is, what does that translate to? And that's what you're talking about. How do we give voice, effective voice, to the various manifestations of unrest we see, which are reflecting the real life circumstances and injustices that particular groups feel that nobody is paying proper attention to. So we've lived in a world where ourselves in labour management relations, where you had movement, and the point about movement was movement went to organisation. They were called unions. That was your mechanism for voice. You've talked about new forms of voice, but the other thing you've talked about is just the fact that what we once talked about through unions, which was frankly predominantly white, male-dominated mechanisms of voice, we're now seeing, in fact, a whole series of other questions. So Ray Cooper asks on the web about how do we deal with the issue that many of the jobs you're talking about that have been impacted in the pandemic are feminised? And you talked about different family circumstance. What about that voice? What does that mean for our traditional forms of voice and how they're used? Black Lives Matter, very important in the United States, but also in Australia. So this is voice coming at us in different and entirely legitimate forms, but in fact, our normal mechanism for giving it action in the workplace has been a relatively traditional one. I know it's changed. Could you just reflect on that? Because this is at the base of a new social contract.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Ray, for raising that point. I should have given it more emphasis in my own remarks because I'm very concerned about it. The good news is a lot of the leadership from below is coming from women. And now I'm going to say something a bit out of school, and it's just because we're among good friends and colleagues. There's no secret we have an election coming up. And there's an enormous number of people working on this election, enormous number of people working for a particular campaign. And many, many leaders in that effort that I've interacted with now are women and younger women. Well, it's not hard to be younger than I am at the moment, but setting that aside, it's the vibrancy and the drive, the ideas, the energy, the militancy, I would say, comes through. And I think that's the best sign that we are going to open up and give the next generation an opportunity to really drive the changes. Those of us who have been around for a long time certainly are going to add our views and maybe our experience and maybe some of the scars from past battles. But I think the future is going to be driven by the next generation. We have to open up. Those of us who have been around can't just sit around and say, oh, we've heard all that before and, you know, we know better. That, though, if I ever start to say that, you all are, as good friends, let me know about it in no uncertain terms. And others probably will as well, because I think we have an opportunity to let the people who have the skills in using social media, the people who have the energy to bring new approaches to bear, to find their way. Now, I'm not naive about this. There's going to be strong resistance. And some of that resistance will come from our more traditional institutional leaders, some from the labor movement, certainly some from business as well, and some from government. And we have to open up and provide the avenues, the opportunities, and the supports, because we can be supporters, but we can't be the ones who think we have the solutions. If we approach it that way, we will find that we're going to lose young people. That's a big worry in this political campaign. There's so much energy around climate change, around gender equity, around racial equity, around other issues that young people are experiencing. And their concerns about their careers coming out of this pandemic are legitimate and need to be addressed. So if we just open up to our institutions, to new forms of participation, not worrying about whether they have formal union representation or some other mechanisms, and then provide them the protections against retaliation and give them an opportunity to come into leadership, I think we will all be better. I'm hopeful that our institutions will respond. I worry about some of the debates and some of the resistance there will be, but I think it's up to us to drive that innovation and to open up those channels for new voices.
Thank you, Tom, for that. And I think that goes to some, I hope, of what Ray Cooper was asking. Can I take you to just that point you're making at the end? Because the traditional forms of finding voice, particularly through workplaces, we know have been unions, and you are looking at all the other, you've raised a whole series of other mechanisms, and you've referred to other social groups. And Russell Lansbury's, of course, asked the question quite perceptively, as you might expect, that given unions, particularly in the United States, have quite a limited role in a whole range of industries and workplaces, how are other groups formed and able to operate effectively to advance the voice of people in those circumstances where, and we know in the United States it can be quite hard to get union representation, in Australia a different circumstance, but nevertheless, thinking that these other groups that you've talked about or other groups organised, this is actually quite a challenge for how they come together to actually give voice, because a lot of these things are going to have to be dealt with through work and employment, since it's not the only place, but it's one of the significant places where inequality is experienced.
That's exactly right, and it's a big challenge. We're not going to get there by reviving unions through the our National Labor Relations Board procedures. They are so bankrupt and so impossible for people to navigate through to get an agreement. Yes, we're going to, if we may see some of that grow, and we are seeing a bit of it grow now. And if we have an opportunity to have a significant debate around labor policy, then I hope we won't just try to narrowly reform labor law. If we do that, we'll fail. First of all, it will be very hard to do. Secondly, even if modest reforms are passed, it won't help address the deeper issues we're talking about. We have to open up that law, and we have to open it up by expanding coverage, not under the law, but expanding voice and rights to participate to workers who are left out. And we have to find ways to give universal rights to people to express rights on safety issues. We have to find ways to use our government purchasing power to set standards for all contractors who provide goods and services or who bid on contracts. That's the way we spread equal employment opportunity in the 1960s and affirmative action through those kinds of requirements. And I think we can do that for labor standards in general, for safety conditions, and for worker voice. And so there are a number of proposals floating around on how to do that. And I think if we get on with those, we'll extend the rights to voice, and we'll protect people, but we'll allow the various forms to emerge, and we will see all kinds of growth of organizations of a variety of sorts. Now, making them sustainable and building them to scale and building them to have the power that unions traditionally have had through collective bargaining is a tall order, and that's going to take time. But we have a historic opportunity in front of us to respond to this crisis and to see what people out there are willing to do when they put their jobs at risk, to protect them, to encourage that, and then to channel it. Because we don't just need protests, we also need conflict resolution. We need that to resolve, we need that to reach agreements or to change practices. And we need to reinvest in our energies as either private or public professionals who work to resolve these disputes in ways that really build sustained progress. So I think we have an opportunity to open up our laws and our institutions. I think we have a responsibility to do so. And then I think we have to find ways to make them work so that they aren't just adversarial protests. That may be the first step, but that has to be translated into productive, ongoing, respectful relationships and results that can be sustained. And the organizations have a financial model for continuing to do their work.
Perhaps that institutional question, which you're touching on there, which is quite important, we'll come back to, of course. Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld has asked again perceptively about the traditional tripartite way that you get what you call at national level social contracts across government. But I want to come back to that. But before I come to that, I want to go back to this question of the multiple voice. You know, the standard problem: how does movement become organisation and then deliver gains, which is the basis on which we understand strategy of collective action, basically. An anonymous attendee has asked the question: if a society is heavily polarised, where people don't agree on the minimum terms for mutual advantage, because you have issues about gender, class, race, age, and they may not meld, how do you create the contract? And I think this is a really interesting voice question, because, you know, if you go back to, you know, early days, and I'm sitting in a city where they marched for 8 hours, the 8-hour day, first march for the 8-hour day and won. That question of what are you giving voice to, which is what anonymous attendee, thank you for your question, actually is putting there, is really important, because we can see a range of protests. People are raising a range of issues. You and I might go to inequality as the way of talking about it, but what is it we're wishing to give voice to in order to actually to bring these things together to a new social contract? And I think that's a really key question here, and a good one. I put it to you.
It's a good question, and I don't think I have a definitive answer, but I'll tell you where I come from on this. I think, now I can only speak for American society, and maybe not even obviously for the full society. I think there's such a thirst in our society, in our communities, for coming together, for ending this bickering and this lack of respect for each other, and the signal we are sending to our children or our grandchildren, as the case may be, that's not what we want to leave as our legacy to the next generation. And I think there are a lot of people who can disagree on everything from workplace issues to issues about reproductive rights to climate change, but still can find a bond of civility to talk to each other. And we have to start there. And I think it has to start at the community level. Now, it certainly has to be reinforced by our leaders. And we obviously don't have that at the present time in the United States. But I believe that the next president of the United States' most important task is to bring the country together, to model how we have civil discussions and how we bridge polarized positions. Now, that won't happen overnight. That won't rebuild trust for everyone. And we may have some violence from extreme groups, which worries me enormously in this country as a possibility. But we can't let that dominate our national discourse. We have to start. And I believe, to link it a little bit to Joel's point about tripartitism, that's a rich history in our field. And we need to learn from it, but we then need to go from tripartite to multi-partite, if that's a word. I'm not even sure it is. But we have to recognize that we can't just have the existing institution of business and labor and government, that those organizations need to open up to the voices we are talking about, to the new generation of groups and leaders. And we've got to find ways to address that. Right now, I'll tell you a personal story. We all have children or grandchildren or others that are doing school from home. And so we happen now to live very close to where our two of our granddaughters live, 13 and 14 years old. And we've come together in our own little learning pod once a week. And they wanted to talk about racism. So we worked on a little exercise on how bystanders can help deal with these aggressions in the workplace or in their school or in their social life. Not maybe the worst forms of racism, but the microaggressions that we all know that sometimes can happen. And these are kids in this little group that are very diverse, and they bring their stories and they love to role play how they could play a more active bystander role. It's those kinds of things. Let's train our children. Let's empower them to work on these issues. Let's empower people in our communities to work on these issues. And I think we can make some progress.
This is a rich discussion, and there've been examples in the question. Someone suggested the national plebiscite in Chile on inequality and how that brought a new constitutional way forward. That's a different, way of coming at it. There's a range of questions here, but they're all around the mechanisms for voice and how voice gets effectively expressed and turned into action in this new social contract, I think, is the one everybody's grappling with. Two colleagues.
Marjorie, I think you might have a question, my good friend and colleague at Monash. Marjorie.
Hi. Yes, I was interested, Tom, in your views about what the resurgence of class identification might mean in the United States. Here in Australia, the Diversity Council of Australia has just released an interesting research report that highlights that those in the workplace who identify as lower class are experiencing many more issues, and how this re-emergence of class fits with the other demographic categories that you've already addressed.
Well, I think, Marjorie, one of the advantages of this crisis is that it's laid bare, it's made us more aware of class. It's no question that women, low-wage women, people of color, immigrants, people who live from day to day or week to week in terms of feeding their families and paying their rent, or finding the very basics of life, so that they're the ones who are bearing the brunt. They are carrying us through this pandemic by feeding us and keeping us safe and caring for us when we are ill. And I just hope that this awareness that there is a class difference here from those of us who are fortunate to be doing what we are doing, continuing to work in some fashion in remote ways, it's a privilege and it's a class issue. And so I think there's a new awareness. Now, whether that mobilizes in some ways, I don't know, but I think the class distinctions have been laid bare. And if we don't see them now, we'll never see them. Whether we act on them, I don't know. Now, in the United States, we have another problem, that the social divisions have blurred the class lines. And so we've had a reaction from many angry whites, from many evangelical religious community members, who are focusing on their social identities more than on their common economic conditions. And so we have to respect that as well. We don't have to agree with all of those views, but we have to recognize that that is an important part of people's identity today. So I think the class issues have to be addressed in the context of more deeper social divisions within classes. And I don't pretend to have a solution for that, except to begin to legitimize people having differences, and then focus on our common concerns. And our common concerns for bringing up the most disadvantaged people in our economies, and so that we can get a social contract where, as we start to come out of this and invest in our futures and rebuild our economies, that we rebuild those economies for people at the bottom as much as for people in middle and better positions in our class division. So yes, they're there. They compete for identity with some of the social divisions, and we're going to have to address both.
Well, thanks, Tom. And I'm aware that time is ticking on. I've just had a message from a couple of people who are listening in the UK and saying it's way past their bedtime. And we all have busy schedules. We could really carry on this discussion a lot longer, because these issues are so important, not only in this time of pandemic, but also more generally in the future. And before we wrap up, Margaret, do you have any other comments or observations that you'd like to make at this point?
Just one. I'd really like to thank Tom for his thoughtful and really generous address, and also for his reflections in questions, which I think are important. And I want to thank the people who asked questions, and to say that in this time, and I was really struck by that title of the awful stuff winning. In this time when we're trying to stop the awful stuff winning, those really fundamental questions about how people are given voice, how they are able to speak to and shape their circumstances, is more live now than ever, and is not solved and needs new thoughts. And that we need to give clearly not only more thought to both the institutions and the mechanisms, but we need to think seriously about what we believe that new social contract should be when and as we listen to those voices, and how we do that both at community level, if you like, and national level. And I just think that these are the fundamental things that I think drove probably most of us into this field. And it is important to recognise that they haven't been solved and there is much work to do. And I thank you, Tom, for your very generous and thoughtful address.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and Greg, and everyone who helped to organize this, and to all my friends who participated. What a wonderful opportunity to sort of reinvigorate our energy. We need it.
Thanks, Tom, and thank you, Margaret, for sparing time out of your busy schedule to moderate this webinar so well. But I'd also like to pay tribute to your enlightened leadership at Monash University and across the sector as a whole, not only preaching about the importance of voice, but also along with the National Tertiary Education Union, providing enlightened leadership to us across the whole sector for those of us who work in higher education in Australia and during this difficult time. And thanks also to good colleagues like Chong Wu and Marjorie and Shahab, and also our professional staff behind the scenes who make these events happen. And thank you everyone for joining in wherever you are in the world, different time zones. It's either breakfast time or bedtime or somewhere else in the day. And that's a wrap. The webinar is going to conclude, but let's keep in touch and continue these important conversations. Thank you so very much. Cheers. Bye now.